Over the past few months, we have all watched as the pro-democracy protesters in Hong Kong turned the tables on Beijing, and indeed we have passed legislation in this chamber, and the President has signed that, addressing the issue, and Hong Kong's recent elections really were a stunning rebuke to Beijing. 7 in 10 eligible voters risked persecution to speak out at the ballot box, and the government's allies' political control over Hong Kong collapsed. Hong Kong wants their freedom. And we're proud of those freedom fighters. We continue to support them, but we also must recognize that Beijing's crimes spread far beyond the world of cell phone cameras and fearless journalism. In the far west Xinjiang region, Chinese officials are perpetrating a different and even more horrific human rights crisis. Xinjiang is home to 11 million Uyghurs, an indigenous Turkic Muslim ethnic minority that the Chinese government has tormented for decades. Although the Uyghurs built their lives and a booming economy in China, they feel more culturally and ethnically close to their neighbors living in Central Asian nations. Much like Tibet, Xinjiang is an autonomous region, but after the communists subjugated the area in 1949, the central government increased its control over the lives of Uyghurs by repressing commercial, religious, and cultural activities deemed inconsistent with state doctrine. Think about that. The Chinese communists said these activities are inconsistent with state doctrine. In the wake of 9/11, China seized on the actions of Uyghur separatists to create a propaganda campaign comparing the separatists to Al-Qaeda. They've used these accusations to blame the Uyghur population at large for unrest and crack down mercilessly on even peaceful protest. In 2016, the government further ramped up persecution of the Uyghurs under the guise of repressing terrorism and anti-government activity. Their current playbook really looks familiar. Arbitrary detention of over 1 million Uyghurs and other ethnic minorities in concentration camps that they have labeled political re-education centers, torture for those who fail to tell the Communist Party what the Communist Party wants to hear, compulsory digital and physical surveillance, and the merciless eradication of free expression, freedom of religion, and basic expectations of privacy. The camps have garnered widespread international attention in spite of Chinese officials' uncompromising repression of foreign journalists. But the government's pervasive digital surveillance programs are putting the Communist Party in a position to racially profile and persecute those who threaten China's plans for dominance. Yesterday's New York Times featured a story detailing how Chinese government officials are forcibly collecting blood samples from the Uyghurs with the ultimate goal of using DNA to improve facial recognition capabilities. Although the government claims that these capabilities will place a new tool in law enforcement's toolbox, human rights watchdogs rightfully fear that Beijing will use it to justify even more intense racial profiling and persecution. These violations, all committed by a member of the United Nations Human Rights Council, these are going almost completely ignored by the international community. The EU and the European academic institutions have supported China's research and development of facial recognition technology, often without verifying that the necessary DNA samples weren't forcibly obtained. Unfortunately, American technology companies have supported and profited from China's increasingly sophisticated surveillance capabilities. And tourist and corporate partners will once again flock to Beijing for the 2022 Olympic Games, even though they are fully aware that the Chinese government will track them, record them, surveil them, and analyze their every move. The Trump administration's crackdown on tech exports to Huawei and other Chinese entities, that sent a strong message to Beijing. And just last month, I joined my colleagues in a letter to Secretaries Pompeo, Mnuchin, and Ross, urging them to sanction individual Chinese officials responsible for ordering and coordinating mass internment and forced labor in Xinjiang. But most leaders and executives, even in the West, fail to realize that China's bad behavior is an indication of their global ambitions. China thinks power and the almighty dollar, not freedom, rule the day. Everything China does, from their military activity in the South China Sea and the Horn of Africa to the flood of Chinese-made products into the global market, is done with the goal of exporting their destructive, repressive ideology. What they are doing to the Uyghurs, to the Hong Kong people, and even to their own supposedly loyal comrades, they intend to do to you. The Chinese surveillance state is an essential means to their end game of absolute control over thought, movement, and relationships with other global powers. How far must China go before we reject the notion that their influence will stop at our border? I ask my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to consider their answer carefully, as questions will inevitably rise about the relevance of free speech and the Constitution, or the importance of a strong national defense. We're in the midst of great power competition, and we do not have a National Defense Authorization Act. It would be the first time in 58 years. I encourage my colleagues, work with us. Let's get this complete, because the threats are real, and the more we compromise our own values, the easier it will become for foreign influence to take hold in our society. I yield the floor.